So Bill gave me this nice small subject of inequality and poverty. And of course, that's actually quite a problematic juxtaposition because inequality is not just about poverty. There are lots of forms of inequality, which I probably won't have time to deal with in detail today because I've only got 40 minutes or so to try and cover the enormous conspexus of these kinds of things and the way in which this operates not only on an interpersonal basis, but also on an interstate basis, on a global basis, and so on. We could talk about inequality in terms of the inequalities between the global north and the global south, for instance. But I'm going to try and relate it more closely to this notion of poverty. So, and I'm going to start off, with the world we live in here in Britain, and try and set the scene by talking about the way in which there are structures of inequality in our present society. So when we think about inequality, we need to bear in mind that it relates to issues of equity, of is there equal treatment to people? Are things allocated fairly across our society? And if so, what room is there for restitution of these kind of things? So if we live in a society, as we do, where access to legal aid has massively been reduced in recent years, then clearly one form of inequality has increased because it's meant that people's access to law relates to how wealthy you are, and therefore to make your rights justiciable. It's all very well to have rights written into legislation, the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, and things like that. But if you can't make them justiciable, then you can't enforce them. If you are persecuted in your workplace, then and if the level playing field is tilted in the direction of the employer, then again, I've been constructively dismissed, so I know what it feels like. Then it is again a form of inequality. So we need to bear in mind that inequality is much more than a matter of poverty. There are also, of course, issues of inclusion. Who is actually treated as a citizen, as a member of our community and society, and the intersectionalities that relate to this. So your personhood can have multiple layers of deprivation or inequality. I'm a member of the LGBTQ communities. That affects my lived experience. But I'm also not. I'm also white. I'm also middle class. That gives me privileges. And we need to bear in mind that those also structure how we experience inequality and injustice and how we perceive it in others. There are structures of knowledge. So if we turn to Wesley for a moment, he talks about one great reason why the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is because they so seldom visit them. Out of sight and out of mind. And there is therefore this enormous empathy gap that you can see in societies, the ignorance of so many people about injustices, or indeed a form of I'm all right, Jack approach to these kinds of things. And the way in which what we think about, how we understand the world, will structure how we perceive inequalities and injustice. The structures of information, who actually owns the media, and who controls the messaging that goes in our society, and all the stories which don't get communicated. And I'll be sharing some of those as we go through. We have this question of treatment of the law in society. We have the way in which certain stories are bigged up as being really good. So I was at the Royal Geographical Society conference over the summer, and I heard a brilliant paper about carbon colonialism. You've heard of carbon colonialism, but perhaps not everyone has. This is the way in which Western societies go, oh, we're doing all right in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, except this country isn't. But what you're simply doing is exporting carbon emissions to other countries where you also exploit workers. You have exploitation and inequalities hidden in plain sight through statistical artifice. And I suppose the final thing I want us to think about today is the extent to which churches can function as counter-publics, as ways in which we're not just loitering alongside the poor, but we're also trying to speak truth to power and confront structures of injustice that we find within our societies. So, let's think about poverty and inequality. There is, of course, a history of lots of myths about poverty. In some ways, we live in a society where myths about the deserving and undeserving poor, embedded in the 19th century poor law, are still with us. John Wesley avoided talking about the poor laws during his long ministerial career, but he did challenge some of those assumptions in saying they are poor only because they are idle is a devilishly false notion. And of course it is. There are questions about how do we measure poverty? We could talk about there are people who are income poor but asset rich. There are people who have fuel poverty. This country has the highest level of food insecurity in Europe. There's something for the Tories to be proud of. So all of those things are forms of inequality and poverty, which we need to bear in mind. If you have a situation in which you can't get access to lots of the goods in our society because of the way in which income is distributed. So the median income in this country is well below the mean income, which reflects the way in which the relatively well-off are so much better off than the relatively poor. It means that there's a whole load of social goods that people cannot access. As Philip Alston, the UN Special Reporter, pointed out in visiting this country 5 years ago, 20% are in poverty, 50% below the poverty line, and poverty costs this country £87 billion a year. Lots of people are one paycheck away from losing their homes. Lots of people are dependent upon food banks. And the worst thing of all, when it comes to this bootstrapping myth of if we just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we'll all be better off, is that the amount of in-work poverty has gone up to about 2/3 of the poor. Furthermore, things like statutory sick pay is the lowest amongst OECD countries. 2 million people do not qualify for it. Over 1 million people are now on 0 hours contracts, and a lot of the people who are affected by this, surprise, surprise, are women, another form of intersectionality. One of the things I've been working on recently is access to public space and how inequalities in public space impact upon people, not least because I come from a community which is differentially affected by hate crime. So this is a report I published 2 years ago, and I suppose what I'm trying to do there is illustrate the multifarious nature of inequality. But if we just think about it in terms of income distribution, what you can see is that wage earning, despite the myths, actually is getting less and less of a reward. Money goes to those who already have assets. In other words, the system is calibrated to favour the already rich. Pay differentials have rocketed in most companies to obscene levels. The poorest quintile saw their debts rise during COVID, and surprise, surprise, the richest quintile got better off. As someone said, so that whilst the wealthy middle classes learned how to make sourdough, the poorest people were struggling to even feed their children. Distortions in the property market have led to huge increases in wealth for asset owners, whilst 86% of renters cannot afford the deposit for a mortgage. And we can see this intersectionality across a whole series of things. So we look at workplace discrimination or policing. If you're black in England and Wales, you're 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. And the introduction of forms of AI like facial recognition technology are likely only to make that worse. Then there's the question of, sorry, I keep on pressing the wrong one, inequalities in particular areas. So this is coming from Sir Michael Marmot's report, where he points out the way in which historic forms of racism have led to poorer outcomes for particular groups from global majorities, where he points out that inequalities of health rise because of inequalities in society. And that means that people have poorer quality lives, that they have lives where they're ill for much longer. So as it says here, this is the first Marmot report in 2010. People in poorest neighbourhoods die on average 7 years earlier, and their average difference in disability-free life expectancy is 17 years. When he did the second report 10 years later, the situation, surprise, surprise, had got even worse. And the policy stance we have tends to exacerbate these kinds of things. You have a policy stance which I describe here in a paper published about the impact of COVID on workers' bodies in this Anglo-French publication last year. You have an approach which I describe as penny wise and pound foolish, that it doesn't produce value for money. You look at the waste of public money by banging up women in prisons for less than 6 months, all of which just contributes to recidivism, which makes it more difficult to reintegrate people into the workplace. But these myths are deeply embedded in a society in which fear of crime is used as a boo word, rather than thinking that we should try and love these people and support them in society. Just-in-time mechanisms have been applied to workforces as well as inventories. So we have essentially a casualisation of the workforce, and those casualised sections of the workforce are differentially female and differentially need access to childcare. I could talk about the youth justice system again, but I won't. So all of this has meant that these assumptions, these ideas, have affected what is seen as possible in our society. In March, I was at a conference about organised by the Criminal Justice Alliance, and they were talking about how can we move the Overton window so that people start thinking about, let's try and create a society in which we don't think, as Michael Howard once famously and stupidly put it, I'll tell you what causes crime: criminals. Right? Crime is socially defined anyway. It's really not very helpful to do that. But of course, it's a simple boo word. We also need to bear in mind that, who are the criminals? Anyone who's been following the COVID inquiry this week might be wondering. And how many of the biggest criminals in our society actually get off? Not only is corruption a problem, but once it becomes endemic, it's difficult to remove. So in what I suppose what I'm trying to say is empathy with the poor is not enough. That we need to think beyond loitering with, alongside the poor or walking with the poor or whatever. We need to bear in mind that there are structural factors which embed poverty and which embed injustice. And without transparency and accountability as checks on this structural abuse of power, we will not get change. And this is where I think the Overton window is quite useful. Overton himself was someone who favoured the kind of policies we've had over the last 20 years or so. But he gives us a quite, well, no, 50 years perhaps, he gives us quite a nice model of how we think about changing public discourse. And this is where I think churches can play a part, by changing the public imaginary of what is actually possible. So John Maynard Keynes once talked about we're all the prisoners of long dead economists, including himself now, I suppose. But though, of course, nobody seems to pay any attention to Keynes anymore. But I think we're now the prisoners of long dead economists, or not actually, not always long dead, like Friedrich von Hayek and so on. And we are, if you like, haunted by the legends and myths that they create, some of which is this rhetorical othering of the poor. So this is where I think churches need to think about, how do we move this discourse? How do we get beyond this framework? Now, I've got this phrase here, relative deprivation theory. Relative deprivation means that not that I'm getting poorer, but I feel that I'm getting poorer compared to somebody else. It's often a good way of explaining why you see, or it's a fairly simple explanation of why you see violent, intracommunal violence in a lot of societies. I always use it when trying to explain the origins of conflict in Northern Ireland, for instance. That sense of relative deprivation is, I think, also one of the drivers of populism, which is definitely a spectre, unlike communism, now haunting our world. The trauma of a fear of decline, a fear of the change of our society. After a church service some time ago, which really put me off going back to that church, I have to say, I found myself spending an awful lot of time trying to explain to someone who obviously read the Daily Mail too often, that there aren't actually that many refugees coming to this country. But of course, I was using statistics rather than emotionally charged stories, which gets us back to how people learn. And one of the things we need to think about is, how do we change the discourse by using stories that can make people see these things not as threats, but as opportunities? How do we change their a priori assumptions and their concepts about what can be achieved and how? You can't have a concept of poverty until you've defined one. You may have a concept of the poor, but that makes it about human beings, sometimes in a way in which you're demonizing them. So this brings us on to the lovely subject of trickle down, beloved of our previous Prime Minister. The man here is a Methodist economist called Sir Josiah Stamp, and in his book, Christian Ethics as an Economic Factor, published in 1926, he said, with a note of horror, it was honestly believed at one time that the universe was so ordered that the man who best pursued his own interest was best advancing the interests of all. This is trickle-down theory. And of course, what he's saying is nobody believes that in the 1920s at the time of the general strike. Unfortunately, this horrific theory seems to have come back and is widely believed in certain sections of our political classes. it is something which is clearly falsifiable by the economic history of the last 200 years or so. It was originally based upon the notion that if you've got a local magnate who spends money on his estate, then the money trickles down to all the people who work on his estate. We don't all work on Liz Truss's estate. So this is not going to work in quite that way. What tends to happen now is if you give benefits to the wealthy bankers, as in the recent budget, they simply go and spend it somewhere else. It doesn't trickle down to the poor. Instead, I think what we've got is what I call scoop up. So we've had rising bonuses at a time of rising prices and falling real wages. Neoliberal theory posits, in the version put forward by Friedrich von Hayek, that the market acts as an accountability mechanism, that setting prices adjusts what the prices can be paid, adjust the level of demand. But of course, markets, as Adam Smith tells us, are always being captured. You know, where you see two or three gathered together, they're probably not celebrating communion, they're probably conspiring against the public. This is exactly what happens in these kinds of scenarios, where you have a sequestration of wealth towards relatively wealthy people and put into unproductive asset classes like property. Indeed, there was a very interesting a very interesting article recently about the way in which the housing market is calibrated so as to ensure that the big house builders land bank and drive up the prices of new properties. Funny that, hence the inequalities talked about earlier. So when George Bernard Shaw, in the preface to Major Barbara, published in 1909, says poverty is the only sin, I think he was missing something, despite the fact that he claimed to be a socialist, because there's clearly more problems in terms of society. One of the issues, of course, and it's an issue I try to trace in my book on the politics of the early 20th century, is how do you create a better society without better human beings? Now, is it just about the way in which you calibrate the economic system, which is kind of what George Bernard Shaw was arguing? There was a very radical Methodist minister in the early 20th century called Samuel Keble, who edited the Methodist Times for a number of years. He was one of the first people in this country to read Marx's Das Kapital, not a great read, but he could read German. So he read it in the original German, and he was very impressed by some of the ideas. So this is a passage from his attempt to set out what a Christian, a Civitate Dei might look like. So how do we distribute goods and services, not in the elitist way that we saw with the Soviet Union, but one where everyone is socially responsible to each other? How do you create that kind of society? Of course, Marx never bothers to explain it. This is Keble trying to do so. The key point here is that he's talking about socially responsible individuals rather than using state mechanisms. I mean, state mechanisms can help. They can redistribute social goods and so on, but you still need some kind of commitment to these kinds of things in order to make them work, because otherwise what you have is what Boris Johnson famously called greed, my friends, which seems to be his political philosophy. So, in other words, structures are not enough. You need socially responsible individuals as well, which is also where the church comes in. So it's not just about having the vision thing, it's about how do we change people's hearts to make that vision work. And it has to work within a framework, which I think we often think about rather naively. I was recently asked to review a textbook on British politics, and I said, but this is useless, because it just tells you this is what Parliament does, and this is what the Prime Minister does, and this is what the civil service does. And I said, but that's all nonsense, because it's all about networks and power distributions and relationships. That's what we need to think about. What I've tried to do here in this infographic is suggest that the 4 key elements in political discourse are power, resources, risk management. So how do we deal with the risk of death, health services, those kinds of things, and identity. How do you distribute these things across different identities? And within the blob in the middle, I've got these are the mechanisms whereby you do that. And of course, institutions include those elements of civil society and the public sphere called churches. Which brings us on to, well, how do you pursue justice within that kind of framework? On this slide, we've got a quote from John Wesley: by preaching the law, I am trying to get people to think about following the commands of Christ as comprised in the Sermon on the Mount. But he also goes on to say, love is not enough. It is true the love of God in Christ alone feeds his children, but they need to be guided and as well as fed, and physic too. Primitive physic, for instance, which goes through all those editions during Wesley's lifetime. It makes me think of the Congregationalist minister R.W. Dale in the late 19th century saying, praying doesn't stop typhoid. We have to deal with the drains as well. Funny that. As Wesley says here, beware of all honey. A doctor who was very inspired by his service at the Bermondsey Mission run by John Scott Lidgett in the late 19th century, though he went on to become a Quaker, is this man, Alfred Salter, the long-time Member of Parliament for Bermondsey in the interwar years. And we have here a quote from him at the opening meeting of the Christian Socialist Crusade in 1931, and it relates to that point about structures or people. If we're going to create a new social order, we can only create such a state through the agency of righteous men and women. So this is, as Hugh Price Hughes, here's Hugh Price Hughes, the founder of the West London Mission in the 1880s, points out. The great social problems can't be solved by individuals. This is something that the church is very much realised in the 1880s. The Congregationalist report, The Bitter Cry of Outcast London, points out there is one form of socialism we need, which is to tackle the problems of poverty and housing. There must be an appropriate division of labour between the church and state. The church, if you like, can try to set, these are the principles, this is what we're trying to do, because the welfare state should not become an end in itself. Some years later, W.H. Lax, who cut his teeth as one of Hugh Price Hughes's juniors in the late 19th century, and then went on to run the Poplar Mission, reflected in his memoirs in 1936, we seek a reason for the improvements in social justice over his lifetime. It's legislation, the role of the state, the pushing back of the frontiers of liberty. And this is about, what do we mean by liberty? Historically in this society, going back to the Glorious Revolution that Bill referred to earlier, liberty is understood as being something which protects us from an overmighty state, protects us from overmighty Catholic monarchs like James II. So it's seen as in negative terms. But one of the things which happens in the late 19th century is people start thinking about it in positive terms. We need to empower people so that they can have more liberty, more freedom, more ability to express themselves. And that is very much what some of the ideas that were being articulated in the early 20th century. So let's compare priority one of a justice-seeking church, which says we should be tackling injustice and poverty and seeking life in its fullness. That's kind of what I've just been talking about. Positive liberties, with a couple of quotes from early 20th century Methodists. E.R. Hartley. There was a vast army of people who were never happy and never had the chance to be healthy. After years of teaching in Sunday schools, he realized this, and he goes, a little inquiry shows that it's not because there were not means to make them happy, but because they didn't have access to those means. The only way to get those means is by production for use rather than profit. And for him, that brings socialism. I'm not trying to do a Labour Party political, I mean, let's face it, socialism's never passed Starmer's lips anyway, but I am trying to say this is the way in which people thought about these things in the early 20th century. The man on the slide, Charlie Ammon, was elected to Parliament in 1922 in Camberwell. And we have here a quote: the object of the work should be for the community rather than from the profit of one man. Well, that's very different from the current policy stance. It should include the development of education, craftsmanship and citizenship. Sounds almost like William Morris. And freedom and self-respect. In other words, we need to think about the individual as in relation to society, and too often we treat these as hermetically sealed silos. We need to link them together when holding a prophetic witness. In the closing passages of my book, and I'm in the closing passages of my talk, you may be pleased to know, I try to set out a framework for thinking about how churches can contribute to this kind of discourse. So it's about setting out those principles, which then inform aims, policies, processes, because policies in themselves achieve nothing. You have to have implementation processes, and then you have to measure them to see whether they've actually achieved what you wanted to achieve in the first place. So in other words, we could see the churches as having a role as prophetic witnesses. Indeed, this man suggested in the aftermath of the First World War that was a principal role of the church. Arthur Henderson went on to be Home Secretary in the first Labour government, Foreign Secretary in the second Labour government, and was a Wesleyan lay preacher for many years. Here he says, the church is the one institution, because again, think about civil society. How many institutions do we have who can stand up and talk about these kinds of things? I mean, academia is often one, and we get vilified for it by the forces of the current government. We have to stand above the battle and hold these things to account. But there are, of course, risks. There's the risk of exercising the harlot's prerogative. So Stanley Baldwin in 1931 talks about the press exercising the harlot's prerogative of power without responsibility. If you're not responsible for these things, if you're not actually getting down and dirty, the thing is, of course, the churches very frequently are much more responsible about these things than any politician. There's the risk of coming out with simple solutions to complex problems. And these problems are really complex. There's the risk of self-righteousness. There's the risk of ignoring the Sisyphean nature of public policy. You never actually arrive. So thinking that we have a magic bullet is wrong. We need to think about what's the sentiment and the process whereby we do these things. And there's also a risk of emphasizing works, not faith, whereas the two necessarily have to go together, and probably in the reverse order. But faith in alone is not enough to deliver good outcomes. So this is my final slide, you will be pleased to know. It's a series of reflections on what I've tried to say. Materiality is not enough. As Ammon said during the creation of the welfare state by the post-war Attlee government, we could have the most perfect system, but if you don't have people who believe in it, who action it, then it's not going to work. It's important to bear in mind some other frameworks for this. I had to do training for safeguarding yesterday, and one of the things that keeps on coming out in that is safeguarding is not just a set of rules, it has to be something which is internalized, and in the same way things like this have to be internalized. We have to avoid simple nostrums. So I spent the rest of yesterday doing some research on late 19th century politics, and you come across temperance advocates who go, well, if people just didn't drink, there would be no poverty. And you go, no, I think it may be the other way round. People sometimes drink because they're poor, and it's a way of dulling the pain of it. So we have to avoid those kinds of pitfalls that the church historically has fallen into. We need to accept diversity and inclusion whilst challenging the hierarchies which reinforce the structural inequalities I've been trying to set out. We need to think about serving people holistically, which I think is one of the things Wesley was doing in primitive physics, rather than the very ableist medical models we've inherited. Ableist models where you have an idea of this is what you should be, and we're going to basically treat you as someone who's really problematic unless you're well. We need to see ourselves as part of nature. We are animals. We are part of God's creation, and part of equality surely should be thinking about it on a global scale. And only then can we say with Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Thank you very much for listening.